So after the release of the first season of The Last of Us TV series, I decided that I wanted to go back and replay the first game, which, in doing so, I used the Part 1 remake for the PlayStation 5. Now, The Last of Us, the first Last of Us at least, is one of my favorite video games of all time. It's definitely in that conversation. And so, any excuse to replay this game, and I'm going to take it. So with that being said, guys, I'm going to go ahead and review the game. I'm also going to review the show in a separate video, or at least, again, the first season. So with that being said, guys, let's go ahead and hop right on into my thoughts on The Last of Us Part 1. The Last of Us is a very special game, and to me, the most important piece of what makes this game so special is its absolutely phenomenal story. So, the game's premise essentially is that there was a zombie outbreak, though they're not technically zombies, where the world is basically, run down and destroyed. And there we follow our, protagonist Joel as he's trying to reunite his sort of adoptive daughter Ellie with this group. But the group is all the way across the country. And so we follow these characters as they travel across the country, fighting off, these infected humans, as they're trying to reunite. And obviously along the way you meet a bunch of different characters and a bunch of not every character you meet is, a good guy. And you also meet a ton of, very rough and harsh situations. And, I mean, there's not a whole lot that I can elaborate on with the story due to spoilers, because a lot of the game's, story bits would end up becoming spoilers. But some of the characters you meet along the way are absolutely phenomenal, and the situations that they're put in are very dire, and it's a very brutally realistic game when it comes to, the world and the place that they're in. And one of the things that I really liked about the story to this game is that as much as the infected are obviously a huge problem and are kind of the driving point of the danger, you come to find along the way that the humans are actually just as much, if not more, of a threat in most situations. I found that outside of just the action bits with the infected, a lot of the actual horror to The Last of Us comes from the people and, the lengths that people will go to survive, and how there's kind of a gray line, and when it comes to basic survival, there is no such thing as a true, good guy, more or less. The things you have to do to make it, so there's some very morally gray or morally outright wrong things you have to do in the name of survival. And so not every, I guess, bad guy you meet along the way is necessarily, a set bad guy, so much as they are simply somebody trying to find their way and survive in this very harsh world. I mean, like I said, a lot of the horror from this game actually comes from the people and seeing what people will go through to survive. But there is definitely, I don't want to use that to downplay the infected. Obviously, there's a very big horror element to them, and, what happens when one becomes an infected, and also just the very basic premise of trying to survive when they're, chasing you down. And within the story, we're treated to very much some sections where the infected are very much proven to be this very terrifying presence. So when I say that the horror truly comes from the humans, that's not to downplay the infected. But I did find, at least for me personally, that it was a bit more, the more impactful, I guess, horror element of the game definitely does come from the human element. Now, moving on, I did want to talk about the graphics of this game, which, when I tried to play The Last of Us back in the day, when I switched from Xbox to PlayStation, sometime midway through the PlayStation 4 life cycle, And one of the first games that I tried was The Last of Us Remastered for PlayStation 4, and for whatever reason, the graphics weren't bad, but for whatever reason, they literally made me sick to try to play them. I couldn't tell you why, because again, the graphics weren't bad, but thankfully, I decided to give The Last of Us another shot when the remake came out, that being the part 1, which I'm reviewing, and I can truthfully say that this is one of, if not the most beautiful game that I have ever been able to play. This game runs very well on a PlayStation 5 console and is an absolutely, breathtaking visual spectacle all the way through. Now, if you're somebody who plans on playing this game through the PC port, which just came out, I think, literally like last Friday, do be prepared that that is not a true statement as of right now. The game has launched in a very buggy mess of a state there on PC. But this is a review from a PlayStation 5 console, and at least on here, where the game was originally released, or the remake was originally released, it's very, very breathtaking how well this game looks sometimes. Moving on now, something I did want to touch on is the acting in this game, which you have some very, very talented video game voice actors and also just very talented actors in general working on this game, and the performances really help elevate the already amazing story. There's certain scenes in this game where, while the writing is already, the story, as I mentioned, is phenomenal, it's elevated that much more because of the performance going on by the actors. You can tell that they're all very invested in the story and trying to make this the best that they can, and I'm very much impressed by the work that they did in this game. It's one of those, PlayStation has built up a really good reputation for their very cinematic story video games, and this is very much one of those. And a big piece of what helps elevate it to that level is, of course, as I mentioned, the acting of its characters. And it's not just the main cast, it's also the side characters. People that are maybe only in the game for an hour or even less are usually just as well acted, if not, at least on the same level. And all very well done, and you grow very attached to these characters as the game goes on, and a big reason that you're able to grow attached to these characters is because of how well they are acted and how real they're able to feel. Now I wanted to touch on the gameplay, which, of course, if you've ever seen gameplay on The Last of Us, it's a relatively straightforward third-person action shooter. One thing I really like about this game is it implements the idea of crafting. So along the way, you can kill enemies and they'll drop you resources, but a lot of the resources that you'll find you need to scavenge for. So in between, chunks of action set pieces or horror set pieces where you're, in combat, or even sometimes when you're in combat, you can go around and find resources scattered around that you can use and kind of have to use to stay alive. And one thing I really liked about that element in this game is I'm a huge fan of the Resident Evil franchise, and up until I played The Last of Us, basically every straightforward horror game that I've played is a Resident Evil game, so it was a very nice change of pace from, in those games, the resources are very scarce, and in this game they're very scarce, but at the same time you have more options, like enemies, well, in some Resident Evil games this isn't true, but enemies will sometimes drop ammo for you, but then if you want to be able to use, craft a Molotov cocktail, or a grenade of sorts, or a melee weapon, you usually have to find parts and scavenge to make those. I also wanted to mention that, yes, I did allude to the fact that I do believe that this is mostly a straightforward third-person action game. Because, as I mentioned, I feel like a lot of the horror comes from the human characters and the story itself. When you're usually playing the game, a lot of the time, while it may be intense, I didn't find it to be hugely scary. I felt that it was a straightforward, action gameplay, or action game gameplay-wise. And that lends back to my point earlier about how I feel like a lot of the horror comes from the human characters, which you do also fight very frequently, but I felt like the story is where a lot of the horror lies versus the actual gameplay. Now, one thing I also wanted to touch on, one last point before I talk about my final score and final thoughts, is the accessibility options in this game, which are absolutely insane. There is so many options for accessibility that this game truly takes it to a next level. You know, you have every option in the world to be able to play this game. Whatever you need in order to enjoy it, it's there. And while I didn't necessarily feel the need to use any of these accessibility options for myself, I just wanted to give that a quick shout out here at the end because I think that it's an absolutely I love that they threw that in there for everybody. So with that said, guys, I'm going to go ahead and give my final thoughts on the game as well as my final score. So one thing you may have noticed through my review for this game is that I never mentioned anything bad. And that's because that while I don't think this game is perfect, I couldn't tell you what would be wrong with it. So it's probably no surprise that I'm going to give The Last of Us Part 1 a perfect score of a 10 out of 10. So with that, guys, my review is basically complete. The Last of Us Part 1 is definitely, as I mentioned earlier, one of my favorite games of all time. And also to go along with this, I believe I mentioned in the intro that I do plan on reviewing the first season of the show as well. So hopefully you guys can look forward to that, and hopefully it shouldn't be too long before I'm able to put my thoughts out there. With that being said, guys, thank you for watching today's video. If you enjoyed, a like is always appreciated, and if you're new here, a subscription is also appreciated, of course. I do intend to be posting some, videos more frequently coming up soon. I have quite a few that are actually already mostly finished anyways, so hopefully it shouldn't be too long before we start to see more content coming. With that being said, guys, thank you again for watching today's video, and hopefully you can look forward to some future videos coming pretty soon here. Alrighty, I'll see you guys later.